Programs. You saw that 20% of our funding goes to programs, and we have 11 major programs throughout the state. Next slide there. We have our empty stocking fund. The Penrose House, which I asked if you had been there, we get about 45,000 individual visits a year, and we don't charge. There is no cost for being at Penrose House if you're a nonprofit or a governmental agency. Now, for-profit entities we don't use at the house because it's just too complicated within the tax code. The Awards for Excellence is something that we do every year and have for 24 years awarding. Have any of you been with an organization that received an Awards for Excellence from El Pomar? Well, we're very proud of that program, and I think it has an impact statewide. Next slide. The Emerging Leaders Program, the second one over, this was developed by El Pomar. It's basically in the Pikes Peak region in southern Colorado. Council on Foundations in 2008 said it was the most innovative and creative program, bringing Hispanics, African Americans, and Native Americans into the mainstream and being able to be part of the nonprofit structure and nonprofit boards. The American Council of Young Political Leaders, we bring in delegations every year. We've had 63 delegations come through from 38 countries, I believe, and it gives an opportunity for this next group, which is our fellowship program. And I want you to think about this one. We have a program where college graduates, after they graduate, come to El Pomar and work with us for 2 years. And we've had 260 go through that program. And they're some of the leaders, whether it's Betcher, whether it's Daniels, their senior leadership have people that have been through our programs. And they're running nonprofits around the state of Colorado. And what we teach is not only, there are a lot of great ideas out there, but you have to have the ability and certainly the knowledge for a business case for whatever you're doing. It's more than just the idea. There are a lot of great ideas, but you need that business case, and that's what we do through the programming that we have for these really smart young people that are going out into the nonprofit community. And we're very proud of that program, no question about it. The historic properties, you know, the biggest historic property we have is the shrine on the side of Cheyenne Mountain. Have any of you ever seen that? If you're playing golf and the bells ring, you know, then you probably didn't like seeing it. But the fact is that it's there, and that's where Mr. and Mrs. Penrose are buried. Interesting story. In 1920, actually it had been 34, when Mr. Penrose was, no, that's right, it's 26. 1926, when he was building this, he decided that it was going to be the Spencer Penrose Shrine of the Sun. And Mrs. Penrose said, ooh, that doesn't look good when you have a memorial to yourself. So he finally named it for Will Rogers. I don't even know whether he knew the guy, but that's what he ended up doing. The next slide. I talked about the fellowships. And I should go back for just a moment and say, if you have friends, children, siblings, anyone who's graduating from college and has an interest in nonprofits, you should have them look on the website at what is available. Last year we had 400 applications and we hired 11. It's a competitive process. However, we're looking for Coloradoans to be in the program, because when they finish that program, we'd like to see them stay here and make the nonprofit sector flourish in the state of Colorado. Some of the other programs we have, why don't we go to the next slide? The regional partners. Do any of you live outside of Metro Denver? Well, we have 11 councils around the state of Colorado that are truly making a difference. We have about 70 individuals that are on those councils. 10 or 11 of them are elected officials, mayors, state representatives, state senators, and the others are business people people that know what their communities want. And in those, we give each of, why don't we go to the next slide? We give to each of them an opportunity to really tell us what is going on in their community and what the needs are, rather than our telling them what we think should be going on. It's been a very successful program, actually. This is some of the, a couple of the folks that have been involved. And it does, from all walks of life. Why don't you cut that for just a second? All of you have to share that with me. The fact is that this really does make a difference throughout the state. Next slide, please. This is just the basic format that we have in the 11 regions, and we have contributed through this program about $15 million, with $600,000 going to each of the 11 regions. And as you can see, it's not by population, it's by region. So there's a real emphasis on the rural areas. Next slide, please. This is the Will Rogers Shrine that I was talking about. It's a great view of the city. It's really terrific. And next slide. This is the Penrose house that I talked about, and Mr. and Mrs. Penrose a few years ago. Next slide. Now let me tell you the history of the Broadmoor. It's interesting. Since 1918, there have only almost 100 years. There have only been 3 owners. Spencer Penrose, and he owned certainly the Broadmoor, but he also set it up in the foundation, so we consider the foundation's ownership as just a continuation of Mr. Penrose. The foundation was mandated to sell because it was an operating entity owned by a foundation in 1969, and we had 20 years to do it. And we sold in 1988. We had about 6 months left, so we really had to move. But to Ed Gaylord, which is Gaylord Entertainment in Oklahoma City, the Daily Oklahoman and the Gaylord properties and the Gaylord hotels. But he did a great job. And then in 2011, someone that you may recognize, even though his picture isn't out there a whole lot, is Phil Anschutz. And Phil has done, for those of you that have been to the Broadmoor in the last 3 years, have any of you been there in the last 3 years? Did you notice an improvement or two? Yeah, let me tell you, he has done a terrific job and continues to do that. The interesting thing is you look at Mr. Penrose, and who died in December of 1939, and Phil Anschutz was born in December of 1939, and there's kind of a cohesive factor then. Of course, none of us were alive then, so we wouldn't have recognize. Next slide. Again, the zoo, the original part of the Broadmoor Hotel, which is great. And next slide. This is the beginning of Fort Carson. Mr. Penrose did a great deal to encourage the National Guard regiments, and then the establishment of Fort Carson, originally as Camp Carson. Next slide. This is the Emerald Valley Ranch. This is in its second year. Can have about 35 guests there. It's a great experience at the Broadmoor. It really is. It's only about 20 minutes away, but it's a million miles away once you get there. Next slide. Originally in 1931, Mr. Penrose built a lodge at the top of Cheyenne Mountain, and that actually was destroyed in 1973, followed by, next slide, the Cloud Camp, which overlooks the city and has 16 cabins, and this is quite a place. This is really unbelievable, but it's way above the city. It takes about 40 minutes to get up there. You go through the zoo, by the shrine, and then you get to Cloud Camp. And next slide. This is the old Broadmoor World Arena, where Colorado College, DU, played hockey, and certainly there were world championships and 7 world championships in figure skating there. And this was the selection in 1980 of the Olympic hockey team. The guy on the right is Mike Ruzioni, who was captain of the American hockey team, and Thayer Tutt, who was the chairman. There's a brand new World Arena, 10,000 seats. The interesting thing about this, it's certified by the United States Olympic Committee for figure skating as a U.S. Olympic site. There's 17 sites in different sports around the country. Next slide. This is the Olympic Training Center. And why don't you leave that up for a moment? I'd like to digress. It was indicated I should tell one story that it indicates about something that as you go through life, the small thing can make a difference. This is a story about sport. This is a story about the time when, as a member of the International Olympic Committee, my colleagues from China were individuals, even though our governments were at odds, I had a chance to get to know. And you go back now to 1981, but not so far to have 9/11. Before that, in April of 2001, there was an incident in China on Hainan Island where one of our intelligence planes, spy planes, was forced down on Hainan Island. Do any of you remember that? They were holding 23 Americans. I think there were 3 women and 20 men on that flight. And this was, Easter was coming up. It was in April. And I guess it had gone on probably for 7 or 8 days. And I was on my way to Denver. And the phone rang, and so I picked it up, and in the car, and my assistant said, "The vice president's on the line for you." And I said, "The vice president of what?" And no, she said, "The vice president." But it was Vice President Cheney, and he indicated that he and the president were asking if I would use a back channel to see if I couldn't get these individuals released. And that the Red Army was asserting itself dramatically in the way that it was addressing this issue, and the civilian authorities in China had really let them have full run at this. Our ambassador couldn't get anything done. In fact, they wouldn't see him. And through other diplomatic channels, we were making no progress. And I didn't know till later, but what precipitated the call was that the president and Roland Betts, who was on the board of the United States Olympic Committee, and Condi Rice were at Camp David. Well, Roland Betts, and by the way, I really like George W. Bush. This next story is probably, you say, well, that. Anyway, George W. Bush and the Roland Betts are watching a movie, and the movie was Traffic. You may have seen this. This doesn't make any difference. And Condi Rice comes in and says, "Mr. President, I've got to talk with you." He said the Chinese situation is terrible, and it's getting worse. And the president says, and I say this with all due respect, the president says, "Hey, give me 10 minutes. There's only 10 minutes left in the movie." And so at the end of that, Roland Betts is the guy that tells me the story. He was the principal owner of the baseball team where the Texas baseball team where the president was a minority holder. Anyway, he says, "Betts, come on down here. We're going to see what Condi's got." And he said, he just cleared me and went in the top secret room. And she explains what is happening to the president. Condoleezza Rice does. What is going on? And with Easter coming up, just a few days away, what this is going to mean for the future of Chinese-U.S. relationships. And she said, as I said earlier, that the vice president passed on, you know, we have a situation here that is not going to get better. And the president, on his own motion, says, hey, Betts, said, you're part of the Olympic movement. Don't the Chinese want to have the 2008 Olympics, and aren't they going to vote on that pretty soon? And he said, yeah. And he said, well, don't we have some members of the International Olympic Committee that vote? And Betts says, yeah. And he said, well, who's the most senior member? And he gave a name I'm not going to use, was a woman from Los Angeles. And the president said, well, let's get a hold of her. And she said, she hates you. And so he said, well, do you have any thoughts? And he said, well, Bill Hybl's a member. He said, the Broadmoor guy? And he said, yeah. He said, but he's the least senior of the people. And that's why I got the call. Now we go forward to the call from the vice president. And, you know, he explained what was going on. And then he gave me the Mission Impossible paragraph. You know, we'll have to disavow. Yet I said, you're on your own here. You're doing this as a private citizen. So I got off the phone, and sport again plays a great role. And I called Henry Kissinger, who I'd worked with in the revamping of the code of the International Olympic Committee. And this guy is brilliant. And a man of few words, really. And I explained to him what was going on. And I'm not going to try and use his voice inflection, but he said, well, you know, you've got to just do 3 things. And I figured, well, he said, first, you have to reassure the Chinese when you call them that you're calling as a friend. You have to make sure they know that. And you have to also tell them that this is very important in the U.S. And the third thing is you have to talk and explain about Easter and how all of these parents of all of these detainees will be on television round the clock, and it will be terrible for Chinese relations. And he said, oh, one other thing. Don't mention you have a vote this summer. They know that. And so I called actually I called my wife and said, we're going to be in my office at whatever the time was, because they were 14 hours ahead, so I sent a fax, that's how long ago it was, to each of the 4 people that were important in the sport movement in China. And then I asked for a time to call them at 8 our time the next morning. So we get back, and I have a Mandarin interpreter from the Air Force Academy that was cleared to handle this. And using 2 phones in my office, we called. Put the first call in, and my friend, who was the same class I was in the International Olympic Committee, was in Saudi Arabia. Next, Mr. Zhang. And then I called the president of the Chinese Olympic Committee, and he was up country in Mongolia. My next call was to Mr. Tu, who was the Secretary General, the chief staff person. And Mr. Tu, when I tried to explain what I was calling about, acted as though he had no idea what I was talking about. But the last one's the most senior person, Mr. He, in China, former Minister of Sport and Health. And he's on the standing committee, and in China there are 12, 15 on the Politburo, the highest, then about 75 on the standing committee, kind of like a cabinet level in our country. But my interpreter said they're not telling the truth. They said that he's in the shower and he'll call you back. Well, he wasn't in the shower. He wanted to find out why I was calling before he responded. So Mr. He calls back, and I'm recording the conversation, and the recorder goes off, and my wife's yelling, it's beeping on him. But the fact is that Mr. He, after a couple pleasantries, his English is good. And my Mandarin isn't, so we were in English. But he said that there was no question that he knew about this, and he said it was just another sign of American aggression. And he said, your president doesn't care. And I said, well, I think that's... He says, no, it's aggression, and your president doesn't care. And he said, your people don't... I said, wait a second. I said, Mr. Hay, then I let all those admonitions go out the window, and I said, let me repeat this. This government, this president, this vice president care about what is happening. They care about our relationship. And, of course, what I'm saying is I just wasn't calling as a sports guy anymore. But the fact is that it turned the tide, because after telling I only call as a friend 10 times and that Easter was coming up, he said, let me take this to the highest responsible authorities. That was now 8 o'clock, and let me get this right. It's 8 o'clock their time, 6 o'clock at night our time, because then my wife and I go out for dinner. The next morning, I'm on the treadmill at the fitness center at the Broadmoor, and this is about, probably 5:45. And I'm looking, and CNN comes on, and they say, breaking news. The president will announce within the hour the release of our 23 captives. And so there's some poor guy on the treadmill next to me, and I give it a big no shit, and run out to call the vice president to see what's going on. And he was in with the president because they met every morning at 8. And so I called Dr. Kissinger, and then we got disconnected because he lives right by the East River. But the vice president called back right as I was disconnected. And he said that, they changed last night. He said there's something influenced them. We think you played a big role in this, but we're not sure. Our diplomats said they finally started listening to them. He said, we don't believe that because they didn't listen to them for the 10 days before that. So he said, well, get all the information you can, and I did. Started getting, Mr. Hay wrote a fax back to me and pretty much took credit for the whole thing. But it wasn't till after that, as we get to this, go through this whole process. The next day, the vice president said, call me each day till we know where we are. So I did. And then the third day, and we have Sunday is, this is now Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, so Sunday is Easter, so it really was important that this be settled. And the vice president said, hey, this is great, appreciate it, anything we can do for you? And I said, well, Mr. Vice President, Governor Owens and Senator Allen put me in to be the United States representative to the United Nations, and they heard that that position has already been filled. And he says, let me get back to you. The White House personnel called me the next day and said, the president's going to nominate you to be the United States. This is how it all kind of wraps, the United States representative to the General Assembly of the United Nations. I don't tell that story very often, but they told me today they wanted to hear a story that they aren't going to read anyplace else. And you're not going to read that anyplace else. Out in California, Condi Rice told me I should write a book on it. She says, it's got just enough interest for those people that remember the Hainan incident. Anyway, let me just say I'm kind of at the end of my prepared remarks. I've got some more slides, but I'm probably standing between you and another glass of wine